In Section 10, which actually represents the halfway point to finishing the final module in the entire training program, we're going to study less than truckload transportation, aka LTL. This should make a lot of sense, actually. Companies use LTL services when they don't have enough cargo to complete a full truckload shipment. They only want to pay for the amount of space or weight that they occupy in a 53-foot trailer. Second bullet, in certain circumstances, LTL service can be used for purposes of domestic on-forwarding. A couple of quick examples to illustrate that point. Goods moving out of a transload facility to multiple destinations around the U.S. As we also discussed previously, merchandise entering the commerce of the U.S. from a foreign trade zone, meaning goods are already in an FTZ and are now being taken out and shipped via LTL to wherever they're going. And of course, goods entering the commerce of the U.S. from a straight-up bonded warehouse, not necessarily an FTZ. Regardless from where goods are coming or where they're going, the operational as well as pricing components of shipping LTL are totally different from full truckload. We'll get into a lot of the details about what those differences are. We can begin in our second bullet point by saying that LTL shipments typically range from 150 pounds to 15,000 pounds. We saw that actually in our FTL online quoting example, and up to 750 cubic feet and or 7 pallets. We also saw that. Once we get beyond that 750 cubic feet, 7 pallets, then it becomes a partial FTL load. More on that in just a bit. What's really important as we dig deeper into this subject of LTL is that less than trailer load pricing is based on a freight consolidation model, just like we saw in ocean freight, just like we saw in air freight. Freight is consolidated, meaning there are multiple shippers and multiple consignees in an LTL trailer. From there, we can finish up this slide and say that LTL pricing is based on the concept of commodity classification. And without letting the cat out of the bag completely, commodity classification is the way in which LTL carriers deal with the issue of dense cargo versus very voluminous cargo. How do they price for ball bearings versus ping pong balls? This is a fairly complex conversation, and it's very important that we understand the underlying concepts that drive it. Change of title in this slide. We're going to start talking about the National Motor Freight Traffic Association. We'll begin in bullet 1 stating that commodity classification is driven by the characteristics of a product's transportability. Once again, let's get it out there that freight classification is about distinguishing and identifying dense cargo versus voluminous cargo. Within that framework, transportability deals with things like, can cargo be stacked? Is it over length? Will it crush other cargo because it's too heavy? How transportable is this cargo? We'll get into that in greater detail, but the concept is important to introduce almost immediately. Second bullet, the organization that oversees commodity classification is this NMFTA, the National Motor Freight Traffic Association. They are the entity that helps to classify freight as either really dense, really voluminous, or somewhere in between both ends of that spectrum. The tool that is used, and we'll see it in some detail, to engage in classification comes from the NMFTA and is called the NMFC, the National Motor Freight Classification. A trade tip, commodity classification is the method used by the LTL industry to account for, as we've already said a couple of times now, dense versus voluminous freight. Who is this National Motor Freight Traffic Association? It is a nonprofit membership organization with its headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. The members are comprised of motor carriers that are engaged in interstate, intrastate, and foreign commerce. We define the three of these as being interstate, truck movements that cross state lines, intrastate, truck moves that remain within a single state, and foreign commerce, which is trucking between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico. Here's the thing about the NMFTA. One of their primary functions is to maintain and publish the National Motor Freight Classification, which provides guidance on how to identify and price for really dense versus really voluminous cargo and anything in between. What is this NMFC? It is an LTL commodity classification standard that all truckers agree upon that provides a comparison of commodities moving in that interstate, intrastate, and foreign commerce. Commodities, products essentially, are grouped into one of 18 classes, from a low classification of 50 to a high of 500. As we said in previous sections, and just a few moments ago as well, the NMFC is the tool that the LTL industry uses to identify and classify dense versus voluminous cargo. Our trade tip sheds further light on this story because it works like this. The lower the classification, of 50 for example, the more dense the cargo. Conversely, high classifications represent varying degrees of voluminous cargo. We could make the argument a classification of 50, ball bearings. A classification of 500, ping pong balls. The pricing is going to differ based on that density versus voluminous. Typically, but not necessarily always, the lower the class, the lower the rate, which is expressed on a per hundredweight basis. More on that a little bit later. Let's elaborate a bit more on this whole concept of transportability that we mentioned briefly a few slides back. Transportability, which influences a freight's classification as well, is determined by 4 transportation characteristics. The first is density. We already said that. Is it ping pong balls? Is it ball bearings? The second is handling. How easy is it to physically handle merchandise? Because the more difficult the handling, the more expensive it is, and that expense has to be reflected in the per hundredweight price. Another that we mentioned briefly is stowability. Is merchandise easy to stow in a 53-foot trailer? Can it be stacked? Can it be put on top of other merchandise? Can other merchandise be put on top of it? Is it extra long? Is it extra wide? Is the configuration of the cargo not consistent with that of a carton? That matters too, because stowability determines how well a trucker can utilize the space and weight available in a trailer. And then the fourth one is liability. We talked about this as well. What is the value of the merchandise? Is it low value? Is it high value? The obvious point being that the higher the value, the greater the liability for the trucker, and as such, the higher the price will be charged. Last bullet. The 4-pronged transportability classification provides carriers and shippers with a standard to begin rate negotiations. That standard, as it relates to the classification of freight, when lined up with base rates perhaps provided by SMC3, but it doesn't have to be provided by them, really creates the foundation upon which LTL carriers and shippers can negotiate. Moving along with this National Motor Freight Classification theme, the entity within the NMFTA that is responsible for commodity classifications is called the Commodity Classification Standards Board, the CCSB. And this is somewhat analogous, certainly reminiscent of the rate bureaus that existed so many years ago when trucking was regulated. It is important to say here that this whole National Motor Freight Classification story isn't about setting prices. It's about creating a standard for the classification of merchandise based upon its transportability. Second bullet, as a brief aside, in addition to commodity classifications, the CCSB publishes commodity-specific information that includes rules around specific commodities, specifications, and packaging definitions. With that said, our main focus is on this National Motor Freight Classification. As a part of their overall work, last bullet, the CCSB evaluates commodity-specific transportation characteristics when assigning classes. The assignation of classes, class 50 versus 500, is not a random exercise at all. The CCSB is looking at a lot of different things, starting with transportability. Let's elaborate a bit more on freight classification and cargo density with a supply chain perspective, aptly entitled Freight Classes and Cargo Density. As we saw in our modules on ocean and air freight, every mode of transport has a method for calculating dense versus voluminous cargo. In all cases, the goal is to A, assure that the carrier is optimizing its space and weight capabilities, and B, that pricing is a true reflection of the weight and or space that cargo occupies in a trailer, container, aircraft, or unit loading device. That should be very clear, this general theme about actual weight versus dimensional weight, basically. Second paragraph. LTL carriers achieve the above goals through the use of its National Motor Freight Classification methodology. It should be pointed out, however, that while the NMFC works well, its methods are quite different from those found in the air freight and LCL ocean market. Completely different, actually, because the classification methodology eliminates the need for taking DIMS and dividing by 166 or doing the whole cubic meter story. The goals are the same. The methods for achieving those goals are different for LTL. Specifically, last sentence, second paragraph, LTL carriers account for cargo density and volume by using commodity-specific classifications. Last paragraph. To use a previous and admittedly extreme example, in the case of ball bearings, the classification would be 50, while the classification for ping pong balls would be 500. Expressed on a per pound basis, which is driven by that per hundredweight basis we spoke of earlier, the rate for the ball bearings would be less than that of the ping pong balls because the latter is voluminous and takes up a lot of space in a trailer. It's the exact same story, the exact same concept as we have spoken of across every mode of transportation that we've studied. The deal here is the use of the National Motor Freight Classification to determine the density or voluminous nature of cargo, and as such, what the rate is going to be for that cargo. This is the last slide in this section, and it's an important one because it is excerpted from the NMFC, and it provides, as we see in our title, cargo density guidelines. Let's see what we have. As titled, Commodity Classification Standard Board's Density Guidelines. Most importantly, the alignment of density with freight classification, what is called minimum average density, in pounds per cubic foot. That's the main story here. How many pounds in a cubic foot is what we're most interested in. If there are 50 pounds in a cubic foot, the class is 50. If there are 35 pounds in a cubic foot, meaning the cargo is becoming more voluminous than heavy, the class is 55. If there are 30 pounds per cubic foot, the class becomes 60. The trend should be clear, even after looking at just 3 classifications. The lower the class, the greater the density. Starting out with 50 pounds per cubic foot as a minimum average density, the class is 50. We start moving down even further. 9 pounds per cubic foot is a class of 100. 6 pounds per cubic foot is a class of 150. And all the way down to less than 1 pound per cubic foot, ping pong balls probably, at a class of 500. Expressed on a per 100 pound basis, CWT as it is called, and or a per pound basis, typically the rate for really dense cargo is going to be less than the rate for really voluminous cargo. There are other factors involved to determine the actual price, but that is a steady guideline to use. We can stop here, and when we resume, we'll get into the LTL pricing model and see how that works.